Thank you very much for that introduction and for the opportunity to present New Zealand's role, or the New Zealand Gunners' role in the Gallipoli campaign. I apologise, I have to leave after speaking, and I can't stay for the plenary session as I have another appointment. It's a tough life in the diplomatic corps. The New Zealand Artillery in Gallipoli. I'll just run through this sequence. We'll look at our preparation, our build-up, our deployment. We'll cover off some of the ground that's already been covered under the Sari Bair offensive, and we'll look at our withdrawal. By 1911, the New Zealand Artillery consisted of a range of garrison brigades, naval and coastal companies, and field artillery companies. Around 1911, our government took the decision to purchase 18-pounder field artillery pieces and the 4.5-inch howitzers, both of which were later to serve in Gallipoli. This equipment brought us into the era of one-piece ammunition, quick-firing equipments, and indirect fire. We had to start to train to understand the novel tactics that were being developed, the use of forward observers, and a greater understanding of combined arms activities. At this stage, the New Zealand Gunners would organised into the Royal New Zealand Artillery, being the regular cadre, the volunteer units of the garrison artillery, protecting our ports and beaches, and the New Zealand Field Artillery, which formed the basis of our deployment that went to Gallipoli later on. Like Australia, before we went to Gallipoli, we had a little diversion as well. Where Australia went to New Guinea, we had the pleasure of going to Samoa to capture the German wireless station that was in Apia. We sent, amongst about 3 infantry company and supporting elements, Wellington's D mountain battery, equipped with 2 ageing 15-pounder field guns and 2 Norfelt's 6-pounders under the command of Captain R.S. Macquarie. You can see them there on the beach of Apia Harbour, where they deployed on the 6th of August 1914. It was a largely uneventful deployment. The Germans quickly surrendered at their wireless station. One section of gunners got an unexpected trip to Fiji. They'd start aboard a couple of the transports to help unload, and without telling anyone, the transport joined another convoy, and they had a few days off in Fiji. The most eventful part of the deployment was as these guns were ashore on the beach at Apia Harbour, all of a sudden the Scharnhorst of the German Navy hove into view with their sister ship, the Gneisenau. They approached the reef entrance to Apia Harbour. The gunners were ashore looking very nervous. Fortunately, they had a quick look and steamed away to the west, much to the relief of the gunners and everyone ashore. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, Lieutenant Colonel Napier Johnson was placed in command of a field artillery brigade of 3 18-pounder batteries and later a 4.5-inch howitzer battery. And this was to constitute the artillery element of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force for Gallipoli. The 3 field batteries transited Wellington, Auckland, Albany and WA, as we've just commemorated in November of last year, and then stopped over in Colombo and Sri Lanka. As they set off again from Colombo to cross the rest of the Indian Ocean, they were advised that the Ottoman Empire had entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, and this changed the strategic picture. So instead of transiting the Suez Canal and progressing on to Europe, they were directed to go ashore in Egypt. The howitzer battery came through with the second batch of reinforcements, and they passaged the Suez about 5 days before the Turkish attacked it. And they were tasked with lashing down their guns to the decks of the ship, in case they need to be used as they passaged. The gunners trained ashore in Egypt and became more competent and confident of their ability to deliver quick and effective indirect fire in support of infantry battalions. The howitzers, however, had no training ammunition whatsoever and were not able to fire at any stage during their time in Egypt. By the 9th of April, the troops were heading back to Alexandria and readying to board the ships. By the 20th, the gunners were part of an impressive array of warships and transports in the Mudros harbour off the island of Lemnos. They were practising unloading and reloading their now camouflage guns and their horses onto pontoons, as you can see in the picture there. What could possibly go wrong? Plans for the coming campaign were briefed, and nervous but excited troops crammed back aboard their transports. After leaving Mudros Harbour on the 24th, by daybreak of the 25th, the New Zealand transports lay off what would become to be known as Anzac Cove. The first wave of the New Zealand and Australian division, including Johnson and his headquarters, scrambled ashore under shell fire and sniper fire just before 10 a.m. The left section of 4 howitzer battery went ashore at 06:30 on the 26th. An Australian horse team dragged them into a concealed position into what became known as Howitzer Gully, and within 20 minutes they were in action. Their accurate fire was in great demand by the infantry who were barely a mile from the beach, but ammunition again was in very short supply. The field guns began to come ashore on the 27th. Lacking the high trajectory of the howitzers, they were less well suited to the extreme terrain. The guns of 2 battery were manhandled to temporary positions at Ari Burnu in the northern end of the cove. By the evening of the 28th, they had been hauled up McLaughlin Ridge to a position atop Pluggy's Plateau by a party of 100 lusty men heaving in unison. And from this position, 2 battery dominated the critical section of the Turkish trenches near Quinn's Post. The guns of 1 battery came ashore over the period of 29 April to 1 May. After 2 unsuccessful temporary positions with very restrictive arcs of fire, the battery was left in reserve on the beach. By the 17th of May, the sappers had constructed a track up Walker's Ridge to Russell's Top, and they were in place there so that they could enfilade the enemy trenches at Lone Pine. Observation posts were established in the front lines, including 2 specifically to direct naval gunfire. This was critical to the battle on many occasions, even though the flat trajectory shell could only engage the forward slopes. On the night of 4th of May, 3 field battery deployed with a New Zealand Infantry Brigade in the south to reinforce a British attack at Hallis. Attacking really well fortified positions, 3 battery were desperately short of ammunition, firing only 420 rounds to support 3 days of fierce fighting. After the New Zealand Brigade were withdrawn back to Anzac, 3 battery remained, supporting Gurkha, British and French troops at Hallis for another month. By late July, the New Zealand gunners had been reorganised in anticipation of the arrival of 5 field battery and 6 howitzer battery. So their force became the division artillery, consisting of 2 artillery brigades and promotions all around. With the ongoing stalemate both at Anzac and with the Brits at Hallis, the Sari Bair offensive was planned for early August. Reinforcements came in from the British 13th Division and a brigade from the British 10th Division. At the same time, the British 9 Corps, at a strength of 5 divisions, would land at Souvlave to the north. There were 72 guns available to support operations in Anzac, but ammunition remained in short supply. Elaborate and oft-changing plans preceded the big attack, with preparatory fire commencing on the 4th of August. The Kiwi gunners fired directly into the Turkish positions facing 1 Australian division at Lone Pine. Over the following days, the batteries helped repel a series of determined Turkish counterattacks as the Australian infantry held on desperately despite heavy losses. The main offensive began after the nightfall of 6th of August. The New Zealand Mounted Rifles and the Maori contingent were the first in action, seizing Turkish positions in the foothills north of Anzac. This opened the way for 2 assault columns to advance up the valley towards Sari Bair Heights. The New Zealand Infantry Brigade formed the main component in the right-hand column, supported by an Indian mountain battery with their 10-pounders. Everything depended on presenting the Turks with a fait accompli on the morning of the 7th. However, the left-hand column became lost in the twisting gullies of the left hand, and it never got to its objectives of Hills Q and 971. The New Zealanders had also fallen behind their schedule, and by the morning they were still below the summit of Chunuk Bair. After initial push to take the summit was repelled, the troops spent the day on the slopes being shelled. During the night of the 7th, Lieutenant Colonel William Malone and his Wellington Battalion took the hill and spent all day repelling attacks on the 8th. Malone was killed on the evening of the 8th, and under cover of darkness, his infantry battalion were relieved by the Wellington Mounted Rifles. They in turn were relieved on the evening of the 9th after a day again of repelling strong Turkish counterattacks. On the morning of the 10th, the Turkish mounted a massive counterattack down the slopes toward Chunuk Bair. A weakened British battalion had relieved the mounted rifles and was pushed off the hill. The gunners, however, found easy targets as the Turks swept forward. A combination of artillery and machine gun fire halted the Turkish advance and allowed the Anzacs to hold an exposed salient below Chunuk Bair on Rhododendron Ridge. The Kiwi gunners sought to augment their establishment by commandeering some British guns that had been landed to support 9 Corps. A scratch battery was formed, which took up position in north of the old Anzac line and could fire over open sights into the Turks on Chunuk Bair. After a brutal and essentially fruitless campaign, the decision was taken in London and the first New Zealand batteries began their extraction on the night of 11 December. They covered the withdrawal of the infantry and then extracted the guns where they could or destroyed them in place where they needed to. Each battery withdrew 1 section per night, and they were manhandled out of their positions, pulled to the beach by horse teams, and loaded into lighters. The last 2 guns were recovered with the last of the infantry on the night of 19 December. It had been a frustrating and difficult campaign, hazardous, technically demanding, scarce on resources, and physically exhausting. The key lessons that were learned from an artillery perspective is that the guns were in too short supply and were unsuited to the terrain. This required them to get unnecessarily close to the front lines, and it made them harder, which in turn made them harder to resupply, particularly during battle. There were insufficient guns in number. There was essentially 1 artillery brigade to support a whole division, where there ought to have been 4. The naval gunfire support was frequently ineffective, mostly due to the communications issues and their inability to fire at reverse slopes. Where they were effective, they could make a massive impact on the enemy. Both naval and artillery communications were still developing at the time, largely dependent on telephone, wire telephone communications, which was vulnerable to machine gun and artillery fire by the Turks. The positive lessons that were learned: the gunners probably had just enough training before deployment to effect the new tactic of indirect fire. They probably had just enough combined arms training to be effective in support of the infantry and their manoeuvre. And once again, they showed the adaptability to overcome the issues that they were presented with and to adapt the new tactics and make them fully effective. Thank you very much.